Hello and welcome to our weekly share on the Parsha. And this week's Parsha is, of course, Shemot. The Jewish people are now descending into a period of profound darkness. There's a feeling that everything has changed. They feel it in their hearts, they feel it in their souls. But maybe that's only the ones who are sensitive, because the vast majority of Jews, as you will know, are welcomed into Egyptian society and welcome that welcome, embracing it with gusto. Eventually, only one-fifth is able to survive as Jews and four-fifths stay behind because they'd rather stay as Egyptians under any circumstances, even as Egyptian slaves, than as free Jews. Anyway, before we start the shir, and of course we're looking at through the lens of the Torah of the Yeshiva of Kelm, and particularly this week we're focusing on the founder of Kelm, which is Reb Simcha Zissel, both in the Sefer Parshas and his Sefer Chochmah V'Musar, and with words also from Rabbi Yerucham, his great Talmud. Having said that, of course, we normally start the shir with dedications, and our standard dedication for some time has been for Refuah Shlema from my very dear friend, and he's related as well through marriage, Rafal Chai Ben Sarah. He should have a Refuah Shlema. He's undergoing treatment. For Oria Chaim Ben Chai Yehudis, the little boy, little baby, who's awaiting a lung transplant that should come quickly, successfully, and give him a Refuah Shlema. Yecheskel Yehuda Ben Yenta, who is recovering from surgery in Eretz Yisrael, and from our dear wife, Rivka Basima Esther, who's recovering from her second complete knee replacement operation. That's the story. The two books that we have, chiefly, there are others, of Rabbi Yerucham's Torah, as I said before, there is Das Chochmah Musar, and there is Parshas. So it was interesting. I really hadn't put this together, but the person who did literally put this together, who assembled the Shiurim of Reb Simcha Zissel, was Rabbi Yerucham, his great Talmud. And it's very, very interesting that in this week's Parsha, we're going to be focusing on the mitzvah, which is expressed fully in the Pirkei Avos in the sixth Perek, that one of the ways in which the Torah is acquired, in other words, one of the mitzvahs you have to perfect in order to be able to come to the Torah. Remember, if it's the 48 mitzvahs, 48 character traits that a Jew has to be able to become to get the Torah, then these are prerequisites. And one of the, we'll see, key prerequisites was called Nosa Ba'olim Chaverim, carrying somebody else's pain or sharing his burden as though it's your own. Now, it's interesting, I noticed that when Rabbi Yerucham assembled this Sefer of Chochmah V'Musar, of his Rebbe's Torah, then the first 6 chapters were Reb Simcha Zissel talking about this mitzvah of Nosa Ba'olim Chaverim. The reason they made it the first 6 chapters, remember, he's not writing it himself, so the Rabbi Yerucham or anybody assembling a book from people's essays, you can decide which goes first, what to emphasize or de-emphasize. The fact that he puts Nosa Ba'olim Chavero, 6 chapters, the first 6 chapters of his Rebbe's Torah on that topic, shows how critical it was to the outlook, to the philosophy of Kelm. And let's pursue that idea in just a second. Somebody, my chavrusa, told me there's a new biography of Rabbi Yerucham. The Mashgiach of Mir was the Mashgiach, remember, in Radin, Mechavatz Chaim Yeshiva, before he went to become the great Mashgiach of Mir. Then Rabbi Yerucham, this new biography, there's a story there which goes as follows. Now, my chavrusa told me this story, I have to be honest with you, it didn't really make too much of an impact on me, but thinking over and putting it together in preparation for the shir, it suddenly became very significant indeed. And that was in Mir, which is it in Belarus, is it in Poland, probably a bit of both because the borders kept changing. But one night, a bunch of Bochum from the Yeshiva of Mir, which, if you ever see pictures of the Yeshiva of Mir, not a huge place, but they go for a walk afterwards. They're going back to where they stay, or maybe just going for a walk in the street. There's no street lights, so it's very, very dark. And suddenly they became aware of footfalls, of footsteps coming behind them. Rabidly anti-Semitic place, obviously, Poland, pre-war Poland. And so they started to pick up their pace, only to hear that the people behind them have picked up their pace. They're clearly being followed. And so they're scared. And they take a turn into either a house or an apartment. I haven't seen the biography to know the details of a Jewish person. They knock the door, the Jew lets them in, they close the door, they, as it were, say "foo" and wipe the sweat from their brows, and then suddenly, a few seconds later, there's a knock on the door, and they very carefully open the door to discover two policemen. The policemen, with the footsteps behind, they wanted to see their papers, their ID. And 5 of the boys had their papers with them and showed them to the police, and that was fine. There was no problems whatsoever. But one of them didn't. But his house was only literally a few streets further along. And so the policeman accepted that and said that they would go with them to the house. And if the papers were there, then everything was fine, and they would go on their merry way, which is exactly what happened. The next day, Rabbi Rucham called a meeting of the yeshiva, an emergency meeting of the yeshiva, to explain that something really, really terrible had happened. It was so dramatic, it was so important an event that he went to the Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Nosson Finkel, to say to him, or to discuss with him, should they close the Yeshiva of Mir? Should they close down the yeshiva? And he retold this story that I've just told you. And then he said, can you imagine that 5 bochrim from our yeshiva would allow another bocher to go on his own with these 2 policemen? He must have been scared. He must have been concerned what the outcome might be. They might beat him up. They might trump up charges. And as it had a happy ending, but he was still anxious. He must have been anxious. And you didn't escort him. You didn't embrace the concept, the mitzvah of noisa ba'olim v'chaveri, bearing somebody's situation as though it's your own. To bear it as though it's your own, in that case, is very simple. Walk beside him all the way. And it wasn't flippant. Rabbi Rucham was quite serious. Maybe the Yeshiva of Mir had failed if this fundamental Jewish point had not been conveyed. So conveyed that it was second nature to the bochrim of the yeshiva. Because if it's part of the 48 ways to wisdom, and that it says in the 6th parak of Pirkei Avos, through which the Torah is acquired, well, if they're not there as a prerequisite, then the Torah can't be acquired. The whole raison d'etre of the yeshiva, as it were, was in jeopardy, or maybe was flawed from the very beginning. Maybe they should close the doors. Very interesting. And the more I thought about it, the more it made sense to me. But the reason it made such an impact on Rabbi Rucham, why he was so upset and distressed about this, why we come to these dramatic conclusions that maybe this is the time to close the yeshiva, is simply because his teacher, his Rebbe, that was the number one thing he emphasized. The proof, the first 6 chapters when he collected the shirim to make his Rebbe's Sefer, Chochmah Mussar, that he took the 6 essays on nosa ba'olim v'chaveri, bearing somebody's suffering as though it's your own. It was the fundamental approach of Kelm. And so it says in this autobiography, this biography rather, it's not an autobiography, this biography, which I say I haven't seen yet. But anyway, I thought that was tremendously important. And it's certainly tremendously important in Parshas Shemot. So if we turn to Parshas Shemot, listen to this. This is astonishing stuff. And it's just the pasuk. So it tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu grows up. And then it says he grows up again. So you find this in Shlishi, if you've got the old Art School English, which I like to use for these sharing, because it's a chance to compare and contrast how I'd like to translate it to how they decided. They're probably right, incidentally. Anyway, Vayhi b'yomim ha'im, and it was in those days, this is possibly an Aleph, Shlishi, in chapter base. And it was in those days that Moshe grew up. V'yigdal Moshe, v'yitze el echav, and he went out to his brothers, v'yart b'sivloisam, and he saw their suffering, he saw their affliction. This is when the change has occurred in Egyptian society from the welcome I mentioned at the beginning to be oppression. And now the Jews are enslaved. And he saw an Egyptian guard beating severely one of his brothers, and famously Moshe kills the guard. But there's 2 Rashis here, which are absolutely astonishing, absolutely fundamental to know what's going on before we move over to Rabbi Rucham, who's going to elaborate really on the theme of the Rashi. So V'yigdal Moshe, Kosa V'yigdal Hayelad, didn't already tell us, just prior to this, a few psukim before, that the Yelad, Moshe, had grown up. So we know he's grown up. So why is it repeating it? No. It said, Omer Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Eloi. Rabbi Yehuda says the name of Rabbi Eloi, Arishon Lakona. The first one is telling you just about his physical maturity, but Sheni L'Gdula, but the second is saying the Yigdal Moshe, not as I translated it or as anybody translates, so let's see how they translate it. it just says grew up, but the Yigdal, they had become great. In fact, Moshe has become, in his relationship to Paro, the exact same as Yosef had become in his relationship to Paro, his deputy, the viceroy of Egypt, the second in command, his lieutenant general. And therefore, Omar Yehuda Eloi, Harishon Lakama Basheni Lagadola, he talks about his status. Sheminu Paro al Besai, that Paro had appointed him to be his prime minister, to be in charge of his whole country. And V'yarbasiv Lois, when he goes out to see their sufferings. Now listen to this Rashi because it's going to be critical. Nosan Enov V'liboy Lios Meitzer Alehem. He gave, or he focused his heart, his eyes, V'liboy, and his heart, Lios Meitzer Alehem, to be distressed by them. To be distressed by them. Be distressed at their situation. Now we'll leave that open. You know, sometimes I think in one of the previous sharing, I told you that there's a young rabbi. These days, almost everybody's a young rabbi. There's a rabbi who's in Manchester, a young rabbi, who's a very, very fine person. And he phoned me up where I'm trying to get him involved in a project that I'm in my next book, actually, which is called Avi Yisamim, the book for children who've lost a parent. Anyway, so we were talking, and generally he told me the following story. He told me that he teaches in the school, special needs school, and there's a little boy, I think the boy's 9 or 10. The boy's in a wheelchair. There's nothing, as it were, intellectually problematic with this little boy. It's just at the age of 3, he got meningitis, which resulted in the doctors having to amputate his hands and his feet. I heard that story, I think about 3 weeks ago, maybe it was a month ago, and I just can't get it out of my mind. I can't get the picture out of my mind. Incidentally, he says that he's never seen such a happy child in his life. He's never seen that child without a big smile in his face. He's a remarkable young man. And I think I mentioned it in one of the previous sharing. But when you see or when you hear something as appalling as that, it sears itself into your mind, into your vision, into your memory. And it's very hard to get rid of it. Again, recently, in another one of my shirim, I told you about my dear old friend, Shlomo Adler, who was a very, very close friend, who was in charge of the Chevra Kadisha in Manchester, the whole Lockerbie bombing thing, where he had gone up to do the Taharas and all the Jews that were killed in the flight, which was over 30. And the sights that he saw there, he said it took him a year to get to sleep at night. Because really, when you see something horrible, you hear something horrible, it takes a long time to get it out of your mind. But Moshe doesn't want to get it out of his mind. That's the point Rashi is making. He goes out to see the distressing images. And remember, it's not just children without hands. It's children being put into holes in walls if the Jews have not fulfilled their tally, not, as it were, to be in any way building material, because they're going to eventually die and then turn to dust, as human bodies do. There's a punishment. So he's seeing children suffering all over the place. But he goes to see that so as not to disconnect himself from the suffering of his people, of the Jewish people. That's what Rashi says, very critical. So let's turn to Das Chochmah Musa of Reb Simcha Zosson, and the first essay, which we have from him addressing this issue. So I'm going to just give you a little taste of this because I want to look at what he says in Sefer Or Rashaz later. But he says the following thing. In order for a person to achieve the level of Nosa Ba'olam Chavero, of bearing somebody's suffering as though it's your own, can only be achieved. Yeshua, impossible. Rak achre, she's ragal, harbe ba'habas chaverim. It can only be that if you feel a love, an affection, a connection to the people who you could bear their suffering with. B'maisa u'b'machshova. It's only if you feel a connection and love, b'maisa and b'machshova, both in your interaction with them, you demonstrate your love for them, and the fact that you think about them. Good. So if I turn the page, let me tell you, read quickly from this paragraph. So apart from having that fundamental building block that's going to lead you to be able to do this, to feel this, to become this, which is to feel affection and love and connection with these people, both in action and deed, there's something else. And he says, There is I found this here. He says Chazal give you a beautiful illustration of this other quality which is essential, and this thing is in this pasuk is Tehillim Kuf Daled and pasuk Kof, and the pasuk says Toshish Choshech, night falls, and it suddenly becomes dark. What does that mean? What's it referring to? The night is Olam Hazeh. It's this world, because in this world, the truth is hidden. Night falls, becomes dark, and becomes hidden. And animals, wild animals, creep out of the forest. As soon as it gets dark, wild animals creep out of the forest. What's that reference to? So the first, the darkness, is this world. We don't see the truth. The second is the wild animals, who are that so it's talking about Rishonim. They creep out into the darkness where you can't see the truth to exploit it and use it for what they want. Why, he asks, do the rabbis use these two metaphors, comparing this world to a dark forest? And I've mentioned before in the share, I don't know if it ever happened to you, but I got lost in the forest once at night. Terrifying experience. It's all dark and you literally can't see a thing and you can't move because you trip over a branch and hurt yourself. So that's a scary image. And then wild animals coming, horrible noises in the forest. So why do they pursue or deploy that metaphor? Or why did rather David HaMelech and Tehillim use it? Because it's impossible for you to embrace, empathize with the pain of somebody else, and to bear his suffering as though it's your own, except if you paint pictures in your mind. And this is exactly what Rashi says. Moshe goes out to see with his eyes and to feel in his heart. You have to see it. In says you can't compare something you see with your eyes to something you hear about as just a story, but to actually see it. Moshe goes out to see it. The reason that the rabbis, in explaining the situation of this world, we find ourselves in this world, they use visual imagery, because without being able to visualize something, then you're not able to capture it and bring it close to you and apply that to say, well, that could be me, that I could be, this is the situation I'm in. That's how you are able to fulfill the mitzvah of Noiseh Ba'onim Chaveri. With the Sefer over there, I don't think I need that at this point. And this is again something Rashi points out later on in Parshas Mishpatim in Shemot, when it says, the pasuk says, "In kesef salva esami, if you lend my people money, esi oni imoch, the poor person with you," and the pasuk goes on to say you mustn't impose any interest in the loan, and you mustn't treat the person harshly. But Rashi says there, why does it say he oni imoch, the poor person with you? It should just say, if you lend my people money, salva esami, esa oni, the poor person, what's with you? And Rashi says a fabulous thing there. You should consider yourself as though you're the poor person standing at the door. Now, I've done that when I was in Liverpool Council. Part of our education was we had to go collecting for the council 2 weeks of the year. We had to go fundraising. Part of the education is to realize that money doesn't grow on trees. It's not just the responsibility of the Rosh Council to get it. The first year I went to America to do this, my first ever trip to the United States, and it was New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Arriving in the windy city, Chicago, in January, nobody actually told me that windy and temperatures sort of like 25 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees Fahrenheit, easily frostbite temperatures, is quite normal in Chicago at that time of the year. And there I was standing at somebody's front door, trying to get a donation from a colonel. The lady opened the door and I explained I was here from England and nobody in the cowl, none of the rabbis had been paid for 6 months, and I wondered if I could speak to her husband. She said, "Do you have an appointment?" I said, "No, he won't see you." I said, "Okay, could I make an appointment?" "No." And I said, "Look, I'm really cold. Do you think you could just ask him?" Anyway, she went into the house. I'm standing there. She said, "Stay there, build an igloo." Anyway, so I'm standing there freezing. And then she sort of relents and said, "Oh, come in." And so I came in and she shouted out the spiral staircase, "David, David." No answer. David! And the voice said, yeah. What is it? Somebody here to see you. Some guy collecting. Tell him to go away, said the voice. Anyways, incidentally, the lady did give me money, gave me $50, if I remember correctly. But the point is that as a consequence of that and the other experiences of that trip, I always welcome people to come to the front door. I might not have huge amounts of money to give them, but at least make them welcome. It's easy for me to see myself as being there because I was there. I can picture that. I just have to take that picture of my memory and put it on the screen of my mind, and then I can see it. And then you react totally differently. And Rashi also says, astonishingly, at the end of Parshas Mishpatim, Moshe Rabbeinu goes up to Mount Sinai and he sees Hashem, he sees a vision, a prophetic vision of Hashem. The Takas Raglov, says the Pasuk, and underneath his feet is a floor which is made up of emerald bricks. Emerald bricks. Sapphire bricks, or sapphire tiles, we might say, but it's bricks. Rashi says, what's the significance of that? And the answer is that all the time during the enslavement of the Jewish people in Egypt, then he had this floor beneath his feet in order to remind him that the Jewish people were at that time enslaved using bricks. They had to create bricks to build for Pharaoh, etc. And of course, the obvious problem with Rashi is Hashem doesn't need a reminder. He doesn't have an alarm clock. He doesn't set in his mobile phone a flashing light or a buzz, because Hashem doesn't forget anything. So what is therefore this Rashi talking about? And the answer is that Rashi is explaining that Hashem was doing this and showing this to Moshe to make it part of the Torah, that we should know that if you want to feel something and be reminded and have it conscious in your mind of people suffering so that you do something about it, you need a picture. You need a picture. You need to create a picture of the exact same thing as this will say. It's in Rashi. The whole thing's in Rashi all the time anyway. It's just that Rashi's so brief. You need great minds like because this will to extract it and expand it. Okay, so you need to have a picture. Okay. The Gemara in the Dorim, this is a very, very famous Gemara. Gemara takes this idea a stage further. The Gemara is in Lamed Tes, and it's on Lamed Tes on the base. And the Gemara says the following thing: Amar Abayim, Amar Rabacha Bar Chanina, the line below. Amar Rabacha Bar Chanina, Kol Mavacher Cholev Noitel Echel Meshishim Betzarei. Anybody who goes to visit a sick person takes away a 60th of their illness. Wow. No, that's quite a statement. And this is great news. The end of illness brings 60 people, and then we'll cure them all. So that's what the Gemara says. That's it. We'll bring 60 people. To which the Gemara gives two answers why that doesn't work. One is it's a reducing fraction. It's not one takes a 60th and the other one takes a 60th, so 60 people, there's nothing left. One takes a 60th, leaving 59 60ths. Somebody takes a 60th of that fraction, a 60th of that fraction. So it's a much huger number, tens of thousands of people for it to work from a mathematical point of view. But there's something else. The Gemara says that it would be necessary that the person, another important factor here, that the person who has that effect of taking away a 60th is what's called a Ben Giloi. Right? Only if the person is a Ben Giloi. The question is, what is a Ben Giloi? So Rashi says, a Ben Giloi, Bocher Kamoisa Zakin. It has to be that the person who is visiting is somebody who is a young person visiting a young person or an old person visiting an old person. The Ran on the other side says something differently, is Ben Giloi Shenolad Amavakeh Mazaloi Shel Choleh. It has to be the person doing the visiting has the same mazel, life circumstance, you might want to translate that as the person there. That is to say, if it's a rich person visiting a rich person, or a poor person visiting a poor person. Now, of course, both Rashi's explanation and the Ran's are linked by a common denominator, because whether it is an old person visiting an old person, young or young, or a rich person visiting a rich, or a poor person visiting a poor person, all four visitors who share that commonality with the sick person are inevitably going to say to themselves four things, or four words. It could be me. It could be me. And if you feel if you picture yourself, which you can so easily do, because maybe you went to kindergarten with this person, and you went to elementary school, and you went to high school, maybe you've been buddies your whole life, you shared, you went into the same business together, then of course it could be you. And if it could be you, then you feel as though it's you. That's the difference between the word sympathy and empathy. Both come from the Greek word pathos, meaning to feel, but sympathy means I feel sorry for you. Empathy means I feel I am you. That's not of Odin Chaveri. And only somebody who's a Ben Gilo can feel that empathy. And here's the deal. The deal is like this. Because you feel it, rewind the tape. In Shemaim, in heaven, for whatever reason, using the heavens calculus, they have decided that Yaakov, the Jew, decides X amount of suffering. For all sorts of reasons, if you're interested in this, I would highly recommend my book, Rufus Alev, your translation and commentary of Shara B'tochen and Chovs of Avos. Look in chapter 3, and he gives all sorts of fabulous explanations why bad things could happen to a good person and good things can happen to a bad person. But anyway, back to this. So basically, the person doing the visiting sees himself as though he is that person. He empathizes. And because they've said in heaven that Yaakov gets X amount of suffering, then because he feels that the visitor who sees himself as this person, it could be me, then feels that same pain. And therefore that fraction of the pain was supposed to go to Yaakov now goes to Shmuel. And as a consequence, therefore, there's that amount no longer available to give to Yaakov. They can't say, oh, hold on, Shmuel visited him, taken away 60 days illness, let's give him more. No. In heaven, it's exact. You said you would give him X amount of suffering. You gave him X amount of suffering. The fact that that's now become diluted and sucked up by others, you can't play that game. You gave it to him. But in the wonderful Sefer Talmud Devorah, in Talmud Devorah, it says fabulously in the Perek Aleph, it talks about, of course, these are an analysis of the Yud Gimel Midas, the 13 character traits of Hashem, and how you're supposed to emulate them and copy them as much as you possibly can. The fourth one is Hashem sees us as being his flesh and blood, a familial connection with us. And of course, there's nobody you feel more pain for than your own child or your own family. Vicarious suffering, when you feel the suffering, you suffer for somebody, which is exactly what we're talking about. So here he says the following thing. Listen to this. If that's the perspective Hashem has in his relationship with us, we should have that perspective in our relationship with others as well. And you should always want somebody else's success. Don't be jealous of the Kvodai, and it is his honor to be intact. And it should be the exact same as if you want for yourself. After all, the mitzvah says, and then here's the 4 words which are absolute gold. Shari who mamish. Because he is you. Shahari who mamish. Because there's a little bit of me in you and a little bit of you and me. As I'll say, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Lazeh. And this is not just a philosophical idea, a Kabbalistic, a mystical idea. This is a halakhic idea. The Chofetz Chaim cites the Rosh, that's a halakhic authority, who points out that if somebody comes to my house on Shabbos morning, when I've just made Kiddush for my family, which happened just down the stairs where I'm pointing just yesterday, Shabbos afternoon, somebody came in, husband and wife. I said, have you heard Kiddush? Will I make Kiddush for you? Yes, they said. Now, if I've already made Kiddush, why can I make Kiddush for this person who's not heard Kiddush? And the answer says the Rosh, because if they've not heard Kiddush, there's a bit of me that's not heard Kiddush. Because they are a bit of me and I am a bit of them. So this idea of Nosaba Ol Chavera, making pictures, picture in your mind to see yourself as though you were there. The Ben Gilo does this automatically. Moshe Rabbeinu did this consciously by going out there to see the suffering of the Jewish people. Is simply a device to allow you to see what is actually there all the time, that they are you. And therefore, because they are you and you feel that pain, then it's not just, it could be me, it is me. It's a bit of me suffering, feeling that there. And therefore, that justifies you taking that pain and that fraction no longer being left there for the person who's suffering to experience anymore. So, having said all that, let's turn to Rabbi Simcha Zissel and I want to read you what he says here because I think it's absolutely fabulous. And it's interesting to know that the Orashas, I haven't been into to find out if it was also Rabbi Rucham who collected the essays in Orashas. I suspect that it was. This is his commentary on the Chumash. But again, there is a huge amount on the subject of Nosaba Olim Chavering. So I'll read a little bit to you here because I think this is absolutely fabulous. So Moshe has been put in charge of Pharaoh's household, but still he goes out to connect with the Jewish people. Now you have to feel, as Rashi says, a connection to be able to do that. Now he says the following thing. Let's go through this story, says Representative Zissel, and see how Nosaba Olam Chaveri, feeling or connecting yourself in order to feel the suffering of other people, worked for Moshe Rabbeinu. And he says the following. So as the pasuk which we started off with, Moshe goes out to see their suffering or their burdens. Rashi says, he gave both his heart and his eyes to feel the pain, to be upset with imagery that would distress him, and he couldn't sleep at night. But through the imagery that he had exposed himself to, kichush would impact on him. Why did you go to see it? Because the rabbis say, as I mentioned before, what you see with your eyes is more impactful than what you hear about. Oh, those terrible things. And if I told you the story of Shlomo Adler saw of the bodies that were killed in the flight from Lockerbie, it would be distressing to you, but if I showed you a picture, it would be much worse. Oh, I didn't see any pictures, by the way. And because he forced himself to see those pictures, that imagery stayed with him, and his want to help alleviate and be part of their situation stayed with him as well. As though he himself is having the same burdens as they have. In fact, there's a medrash that he went out and actually schlepped the stones with them, helped push the wagons. But Paul Mamash, that's what it says. That's what the mitzvah of Nosaba Olam Chavera is talking about. That's only the first thing. So he goes out to see. Fine. Number two, after that, the next thing says that he sees an Egyptian beating a Jew to death. But it's not just that he went out in order to be distressed by the fact of the entirety of the Jewish people suffering, but even an individual suffering. People might say, well, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the needs of the one. But that's not how it worked with Moshe Rabbeinu. Yes, he could see the needs of the many, and he certainly connects to them. But it doesn't distract him from helping just any individual in trouble. Also individuals. When he sees an Egyptian hitting one of his brothers, and he acts again. And then he acts. Two, I don't think it was because it was an Egyptian beating a Jew that it provoked his reaction, his intervention. When straight after that he sees two Jews fighting with each other, once again he intervenes. And of course, one of them informs the authorities, and that's when Moshe has to flee. And then when he flees, don't think it's just Jews, but when he flees to a new land, to people who aren't his people, and he comes across Yisro's daughters who are about to be attacked, raped, maybe murdered by shepherds, he intervenes again. And what happens after that? That's the next stage. Then he gives their cattle to drink, because he can picture the cattle must need water. So it can never be, and it never is, the fact that a Jew is concerned only with the Jewish people. The ultimate role of the Jewish people is to be a beacon, as we mentioned in last week's share, as to be an exemplar to the whole of the world. Everybody is created by Hashem, B'Tselem Elokim. We want to get that right. But in order to be able to get that right, you have to have the picture in your mind, and you have to act and react when the picture is an unpleasant picture, particularly if you could do something about it, which he does. So let me read you just two other things here. So at the top of page Yud Ches, in Parshas Shemot of Orashas, he says, so the Torah goes into all these stories of Moshe's actions and reactions before God speaks to him at the burning bush to tell him to go and save the Jewish people. Why? To let you know, it's not by accident. It wasn't just some merry happenstance or without care that God selected Moshe to go and save the Jewish people, and be the one who would receive the Torah. It's because he had worked on himself to develop this midah, this character trait of feeling somebody's pain as though it's your own. As Rashi said, he went out to consciously embrace the distressing image, to be able to use that to activate his intervention on their behalf. He did it consciously. Oh, you're that sort of person? Then that's what comes before Torah, the 48 ways to which Torah is acquired. And of course, he acquires the Torah for the Jewish people. As we said, that's one of the things that ways that Torah is neatness. And if I just get to the 3 lines of the bottom paragraph, so for us in 2003, if you want to know what could provoke a repetition of us getting out of this geula, just like Mitzrayim, as I began to share, when things start to get dark, we're all feeling the upspike or the uptick, whatever the current phrase is, in anti-Semitism, just as the Jews did in Egypt. They feel it. As I told you last week, the Sfas Emes said, even though the actual really nasty bit of the exile did not occur during the lifetimes of Yaakov's children, the Shvatim, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, only after they started to die. But even then, as I mentioned, that didn't happen until the last 80 years, the nasty stuff. It was a warm embrace and welcome into assimilation and identification as Egyptians. But those who were Jewish and sensitive felt, yeah, there's cold winds blowing here. Maybe it's time to think about getting out here and getting to Eretz Yisrael. And indeed, many people are saying the same thing to American Jews and Western Jews and, well, any Jews who can today. So it says, that's the same formula for today. To go and feel at one with the suffering of other Jews and try and use that identification, that realization that kihuhu mamish, that he is you and you are he, to be able to help them. And as a consequence of that, as it were, to become like the mission that Moshe Rabbeinu was given, now go and do something about it, then we should embrace that mission as well. Because the formula which applied in Egypt is a formula that applies to get out all future exiles as well. I can't resist telling you, or reading from you, one of the Jews that I admire most. In fact, if we had more time, which we don't, because I'm trying to keep this brief, maybe another share, I'll tell you about my connection with somebody who I admire enormously, Natan Sharansky, who was called Anatoly Sharansky. And Anatoly Sharansky, when I was a young man, was in the Soviet Gulag. When he got out, he wrote a book called Fear No Evil, his autobiography, which was absolutely fabulous. And so I thought in my move to America, I left mine behind, but I was able to download it digitally to my iPad. And so I printed this out. And see if this rings a bell, bearing in mind what we've learned. While my own focus was on Jewish immigration, it means from the USSR, and their horrible repressive regime, not too dissimilar to Egypt, I was also active on behalf of people from many national religious groups whose rights were brutally violated by the Soviet regime, including Pentecostals and Catholics and Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars. The Helsinki Watch Group, they set up this organization to watch whether the conditions which the USSR had signed up to in the Helsinki Accords, which was human rights promises, they monitored them, which of course got all the monitors stuck into human rights violations and the Gulag. Anyway, the Helsinki Watch Group also produced documents on human rights violations in Soviet prisons, labor camps, and psychiatric hospitals. My interest in helping other persecuted peoples was an important part of my own freedom, a freedom that became real only after I returned to my Jewish roots. For the activist Jews of my generation, our movement represented the exact opposite of what our parents had gone through when they were young. But we saw what happened to their dreams, and we understood that the path to liberation could not be found in denying our own roots while pursuing universal goals. On the contrary, we have to deepen our commitment, because only he who understands his own identity, has already become a free person, can work effectively for the human rights of others. In Israel, when I was writing this book, I came upon an image by the American writer Cynthia Ozick that captures this idea perfectly. The shofar, the ram's horn that is sounded in the synagogue on the high holy days, is narrow at one end and wide at the other. Nothing happens if you blow in the wide end, but if you blow into the narrow end, the call of the shofar rings loud and true. Just very, very similar to what Reb Simcha Zissel said as Moshe Rabbeinu's approach. He goes out and sees, he acts for his own people against affliction of non-Jews, his own people afflicting his own people, non-Jewish people who are afflicted, and even animals. If I can delay for just one more second, Reb Shlomo Wolbe beautifully says that it's because we realize that everything and everyone is created by the same architect, the same artist, Hashem Yisbarach, that evokes in a Jew a willingness to identify with everyone and wants to activate our Noisel Be'olam Kaveri in directions much wider than just our own people. But that's where we start. Blow in the narrow end, then there's plenty of room left over for the wide end as well. I hope you enjoyed that glimpse into the Torah of Kelm. I shall look forward to seeing you again next week. Have a wonderful week and, of course, a great Shabbos.